Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful winter's night in Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge we're being joined tonight by Amanda Cam, MP, who was MC at our last dialogue, so great to have you here. Tim Mander, MP, and I'd also like to acknowledge Ian Walker, who we worked very closely when I was in the Property Council when he was leading the planning reform, so great to see you in the audience. Tonight we're going to prove once again that it is possible to have civil, productive, enjoyable and enlightening discussion and a civil discourse about some of the most challenging issues that are within our communities. And I can't think of anything more important and more urgent right now than housing. I'm Mac Dermott, I'm your MC tonight. And like many of you in the room, I've been really fortunate to build my career in property. And that's included writing for the Financial Review and working for the Property Council in state and national roles. Most recently, I joined Building 4.0 CRC team, where the focus is on innovation and research as it relates to building, and developing property leaders and teams through my work with Creating Leaders. Throughout my 30 years in property, and I think this is really interesting and I think you'll all feel the same way, the topic of housing has never not been discussed. We've always been talking about supply, demand, costs, skills, building costs, where we can access those skills. But I think what we're now feeling in the midst of where we are right now is there's been a lot of talking. And I think we're all in fierce agreement that we have to bring it all into a much sharper focus and a call to action as we experience a housing crisis and a level of homelessness I think none of us could ever believe would have ever happened in Australia. I'm a super keen supporter of the Brisbane Dialogues over the last 3 to 4 years. And in particular, what I love about it is its commitment to promote respectful discussion and to really avoid that win-lose polarising debate that we often see in political debate and also in the media. Because when we do that, when we polarise, we do nothing to really get to the crux of how to solve complex issues. So I do really want to thank Murray and the team for all your work you do with the Brisbane Dialogues. I think it's a great initiative and it's going from strength to strength. Housing is recognised as a fundamental human rights by the United Nations, and we know it's critical to people's health and well-being, their education, their employment, prosperity, and of course their safety. But the problem is big, the solutions are complex, and the stories are hard-hitting. So this is a really good time to restate the Brisbane Rule, which was specially created for the Brisbane Dialogues when it was launched 4 years ago. And that rule is, all participants agree to listen carefully, speak respectfully, and concentrate on the content of discussions, not on the characters. And that extends before, during, and after tonight, online as well as offline. I was so impressed when I first saw the Brisbane Rule, when I went to my first dialogue at the Tivoli, because I think its power is in its simplicity. And for me, it's what sets this event apart from all other forums. To do some quick housekeeping before we get to the panel. Mobile phones on silent, just a quick reminder. Fire exits, you can see the green lights. The toilets are over there. Feel free to move around unobtrusively during the discussion if you need to. If you need to get some food, just move around quietly. But I think, we'll all be quite riveted by the discussion as well. It is customary at the big dialogues for the MC to acknowledge, on behalf of everybody here, the traditional custodians of the places on which we gather and converse this evening, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to refer to a principle and element of dialogue in Aboriginal culture. And the one I would like to refer to tonight is one that deeply resonates with me when we're talking about housing and communities, and that's deep listening. We come together with a raft of our own experiences, our expertise, and our personal stories that informs our views and opinions. So they're going to be quite a different mix in the room tonight. We want to have a discussion here that is different and a better one, and that one that raises above all the noise we're hearing in the current political and budgetary cycles. And I think the foundation of any quality discussion must be this shared commission to listen and learn and to listen deeply. I would like to thank the owners and management of the Princess Theatre and its sister over the river, the beautiful Tivoli Theatre, who so generously provide these terrific spaces for our purpose and enjoyment. And I think everyone who came in tonight was commenting about how beautiful it was to be back in this beautiful building. The support of the Princess and the Tivoli Theatres has been constant and invaluable to the Dialogues for the past 4 years, and it's much appreciated. I also like to acknowledge and thank our returning event sponsors, the Andrew and Leverous Academy for Innovation and Leadership, the University of Queensland, and our newest supporter, EY Queensland. And many thanks to our regular in-kind sponsors, Pure Gold Films and Creative Productions. And of course, a huge thanks to the small band of volunteers who make tonight possible. The Brisbane Dialogues is the country's first dedicated civil discourse organisation, and it has an ambitious national expansion program through building of the Australian Dialogues Network and via the Dialogues at School. And tonight we welcome students from Marsden State High School who are here with us. Thank you for joining us. Welcome. And it's great to have you here. Yes. Thank you. Now, before introducing the speakers, I'd like to encourage everyone to text questions. Their number will be appearing on the screen. You'll see it come up time to time. Please make your questions succinct, relevant, and add your name, and then they may be used during the course of the discussion. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. My first introduction and welcome is for Dr. Cameron Murray. Cameron is the Chief Economist of Fresh Economic Thinking Australia and author of a newly released book, They love you. The newly released book, I'm even going to hold it up, The Great Housing Hijack. And you have the opportunity to buy the book at the left-hand side of the bar. So thanks, Cameron. Welcome to Claire O'Rourke, owner and director of Cohere Projects, an active and expert representative on a number of industry bodies. Claire was certainly very active and very generous in sharing her expertise on the Property Council. She is the chair of the Urban Land Institute in Queensland and importantly on their National Council, so we feel very well represented. Thank you, Claire. Welcome to Jackson Hills, Manager of Policy and Strategic Engagement for Q Shelter. Jackson is a social and affordable housing advocate and director, and he recently joined the Queensland Advisory Board for the Property Industry Foundation, which is a wonderful organisation I know many of you in the room would be involved with. So thank you for your work with PIF. Welcome to Natalie Rayment, Co-Chair and Executive Director of the Walton Construction Consulting Group. Natalie is co-founder of the YIMBY Queensland, which stands for Yes in My Backyard, and she is a member of the Queensland Housing Supply Expert Panel. And I think it's great to have that panel is certainly expert and doing very valued work, so thank you, Natalie. It's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, Professor Peter Shergold, AC. Peter is a former Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister, former Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Chancellor of Western Sydney University between 2011-2022, and he is a passionate advocate of the transformational power of higher education, innovation in the public sector, social justice and social inclusion. With an outstanding career in public service, education, and as a company director and chair, Peter brings an expert and diverse perspective to tonight's dialogue and moderation. So please welcome Peter and all the panellists. We look forward to a terrific discussion.
Well, thank you, and what a great venue. I have to say, looking at us here, I imagine Act 1, Scene 1, set in an English country home of the latest Agatha Christie whodunit. And that's what it is. Who killed Australian housing? Was it the economist, the developer, the town planner, the social housing advocate, or the politician? Perhaps we shall find out. So, as you've heard, I'm Peter Shergold. I'm delighted to be the moderator here this evening. You know, one thing that I have learned from probably an overlong working life is that we have a tendency in Australia to treat every wicked problem of public policy, particularly if it captures the attention of fierce public debate, to portray it as a crisis. Just in the last few months, we've had a disability crisis, an aged care crisis, a climate crisis, a health crisis, a domestic violence crisis, and thankfully now past, I say with crossed fingers, a pandemic crisis. And housing, of course, in terms of the challenges of accessibility and affordability, has rapidly moved over the last 12 months from being a housing problem to a crisis, to a long-standing crisis, to the worst housing crisis on record. We're told in very loud headlines that the housing system is broken. And we know how serious the issue is because when you look at the Commonwealth Budget's Treasury documentation, there's a whole chapter there from last week on housing. You just have to listen to the budget and the budget reply speech to how big an issue housing is in Australia at the moment. And we get some sense of the scale of the perceived crisis when we realise that the Commonwealth Government has already committed $26 billion to address the various manifestations of the crisis. And if you were listening closely on Tuesday, another $6 billion on top of that. So what is it, these challenges that government face? Well, there seem to be a few parts to it. First, that it is perceived that there has been a historic underinvestment in housing, but most of all, that there has been inadequate and declining public investment, particularly in terms of providing a range of public and social housing. And as a result, housing supply, we're told, isn't keeping pace with the rate of population growth. And as a result of that, there is worsening affordability. Worsening affordability for renters, but also for first home buyers. But it goes deeper than that, because what is also suggested is that it's disadvantaged Australians who are increasingly bearing the brunt of that through housing insecurity, homelessness, and beyond that, that one of the contributors now to the significant decline in mental health and the challenges to social cohesion are in part coming from the housing crisis we face. And yet, you know, beyond the almost universal demand for more public investment, if you look at what's being suggested to answer the crisis, there's this huge list. Here's one not in particular order. Reduce immigration, provide greater rental assistance, train more construction workers, expend more public money on enabling infrastructure such as power and water and sewage and roads, provide concessional loans to community housing providers, make unis build accommodation for their international students, remove generous tax concessions, especially negative gearing, for multi-property owners, allow people to dig into their super to buy housing, enhance tenancy legislation to better protect tenants, place a freeze on rent increases, provide government support for first-time home buyers, make land use planning systems more flexible, zoning rates less restrictive, and one which I'll throw in simply because I did some work on this, improving the regulation of building under the National Construction Code. That's great. You could add another 10 things. The question we want to ask tonight is, what are we trying to solve? What are all these initiatives aimed at? So the discussion tonight will inevitably go to some of that supply and demand of housing and how we should address it. But the aim of this dialogue, our, I hope, structured conversation involving yourself, is you know, beyond that plethora of perceived solutions, what is the problem? What is the big picture? What is it, in the words of the dialogue, that we want to achieve? In other words, this evening, I'm hoping we'll focus on the ends, not just on the means. And as you can see, I've got this wonderful expert panel to help us do that, from Cameron and Claire and Jackson and Natalie. And I think we're all agreed that too often the clangor of political noise, of contested solutions, actually threatens to hide what the question actually is. But not tonight. We are not going to fall for that trap. So what I'm going to do is ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and a little bit with their perspective. And then, and I've already told themselves, which is why they're all looking so nervous now, I wanted them to go to the heart of the issue. What is it that they would like to achieve to alleviate the perceived housing crisis? I'm going to start with you, Cameron.
Thanks, Peter. Well, let me just first say, in this housing Cluedo that we're trying to unravel, it wasn't the economist in the Princess Theatre with the microphone, okay? So, for those who don't know me, I've been interested in housing for many years. I've participated as an investor, as a renter, as a homeowner, and for the last 4 years at the University of Sydney, studied housing supply and the economic dynamics there. And you can read my assessment of the housing market and the way we debate it in my book, for sale up there, The Great Housing Hijack. It's about why we always seem to go in circles and why today's event is so helpful. So I like to start with my favourite quote to set the scene on my views on housing. From a very, very famous visitor to Sydney, they wrote in their diary on their first day when they visited that the number of large homes recently built is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house. That wasn't Taylor Swift in her Eras tour in 2024. It was Charles Darwin in 1836, when the population of Sydney was 20,000. In 1872, Friedrich Engels wrote The Housing Question, puzzling over why the working class were priced out of housing in the industrial cities of Europe. Henry George wrote Progress and Poverty at the end of the 1870s, musing about the same inequalities in housing. And in 1911, the New South Wales government conducted their first inquiry into rising housing rents in Sydney. And they passed their first rent control laws in 1915. So periodically, for 2 centuries, we've had the same property market cycles and the same similar debates at each point in it. And I remember in 2005 to 2007, going to similar events and having similar conversations about what to do about housing. And yet here we are again. So I think that's really important to have the context. And for me, the problem seems to be that when we have this boom in the economy, people have to compete with other people to stay living where they are when they're renting. If everyone else's income goes up and yours doesn't, you have to outbid them for the same house. So there's an adjustment process of the market. Some people win and some people lose, and I think that's where we are now. And I say it's an adjustment process because we think that the rents are too high or the prices are too high. Well, I can tell you that when you survey renter households, the rent-to-income ratio in 2021 was 20% across the market. In 2011, it was 20%. In 2001, it was 20%. In 1991, it was 20%. And in 1911, when New South Wales conducted that inquiry, it was 20%. Okay, so it's not that the overall market is doing something abnormal, it's just during an adjustment process, there are winners and losers. Now, to finish my brief introduction, I just want to think about this end goal that Peter's proposed to us, because I think we too often assume that what we want is the price and rent of houses to go down. And I don't think we do. Okay, imagine if all rents and prices fell 25% in the Australian housing market. Our $10 trillion worth of housing is worth $7.5 trillion. Anyone whose mortgage is 80% of their housing value is now underwater. Landlords, instead of making $66 billion in total revenue, make $50 billion. I'm not sure that that is politically feasible or that's the way we should frame our housing discussion. I think we need to frame it as this market adjustment process. So I'll leave you with that and let the rest of the panellists share their thoughts. Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you. Thanks, Cameron. I'm not sure at the end of that whether we haven't got a crisis or we've had a perpetual crisis. We'll find out which it is. Claire, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Good evening, everyone. My name is Claire O'Rourke, and I've spent the last 20 years developing residential projects. I've worked for large corporate developers like Mirvac and Lendlease, and then more recently I've been running a project management business. But now my time is spent really just delivering my own projects. So I focus on that, and tonight I'm bringing the real-life development perspective to the conversation. So Peter poses a question, housing, what do we want to achieve? It's a pretty simple one for me. I want to have a market that is predictable and stable, where supply matches demand, where we don't have governments that intervene with policies that distort the industry's ability to operate. I want a market that's in equilibrium, where house prices and rents grow at moderate and sustainable levels that is close to CPI. Unfortunately, house prices have risen 55% since 2019, and a big driver of that demand was an access to cheap credit and prolonged low interest rate environment and the poorly executed home builder grant, which artificially pulled forward years of demand and gifted $2.3 billion to home buyers. It also sparked serious escalation in building costs that we're still paying for. And look, demand is still high, but now we're facing the most severe construction conditions that I have ever seen in the last 20 years. New residential developments are just not financially viable. And the reason for that is Tier 1 contractors are saying that they're just too busy with the state government's $92 billion big build pipeline. Feedback from contractors is that they, and also the subcontractor market, have an open checkbook to charge whatever they like, and they have no interest in private sector work. It's basic supply and demand. High government demand for workers and materials is driving up the price of building. Rather than a 5-year big build program, why not 10 years? Why not spread out the demand so the government isn't competing against the private sector? Prior to COVID, we always knew what it cost to build an apartment. But since 2019, I've seen building costs double and program durations also double, which has a huge impact on the viability of a building, of a project. And the fact is, we just need more builders and we need more workers. And right now, I don't know why anyone would want to be a builder. They're over-regulated, unprotected, and marginal businesses. The unions are all over you. You have to commit to a fixed price for a product that will take years to build, but you have absolutely no ability to control the input prices going into that. We need to start protecting and helping our construction sectors so there's a more likelihood of our builders being financially stable. And it's an uncomfortable reality, but well documented in our newspapers that our construction sector is run by the very prominent and active building industry unions. And it's no secret that they also fund our Labor Party that runs our government. They have skewed the market and largely determine what trades and building contractors developers can use. They enforce huge wage expectations and regularly hold up work on site. And no one will ever meaningfully call them out on it. You can't, because you cannot win an argument about having a safe site and caring about workers' rights. But they are destroying our chance of operating in a free market, which is what our country was built on. Even worse, the ABCC, the construction industry's only regulator and watchdog, was abolished last year by the Albanese government. In Queensland, we have had 30-odd years of a Labor government, but now the pendulum has swung too far because nothing stacks and the community's had enough.
Now over to you, Jackson.
Thank you, Peter. Tough act to follow, actually, Claire and Cameron, so well said. Just before I do my little bit, which is a little bit of the past, present and future that I think might anchor the discussion a bit today, I come at this, so Jackson Hills, I'm involved with Q Shelter, who's the peak organisation for housing and homelessness services here in Queensland. My interaction with a whole range of these issues has been in the sub-market housing space, so everything's sort of below market. So think social and affordable housing, think community housing, think homelessness. And it's great to look out over here tonight and see many of our members in the audience. Now, I live on the Gold Coast, where we know that there's 500 people sleeping rough every single night of the year, whether it rains, hails or shines. I know a number of these people. One of them was my friend, and still is, but has unfortunately had a set of events that has caused him to move into circumstances that he never would have dreamed. I travel around the state to all our major population centres, and I see some people here from regions tonight. And over the last 3 years, I've never seen acute homelessness, visible homelessness on the street the way that I did when I started that role 3 years ago. Mackay, Rockhampton, Gladstone, Kingaroy, Cairns, Townsville, all over Brisbane, the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. So we clearly have an issue at that most acute end, and that's again, of course, the group I'm representing tonight. A couple other points I wanted to just sort of mention. Housing boomed in Australia after the World War. People needed homes and work, so Menzies put them back to work with the big build. Between 1947 and 1971, the number of dwellings in Australia increased from 1.9 million to 4 million. I'm sure many of you understand and appreciate this history. During that era, there were fewer regulations, modest building standards, far less competition for government spending. In 1956, about 14% of all those residential dwellings were public housing. Today, that's closer to 3.6%. I'm sure we'll discuss that tonight. Now, Cameron touched on this as well. Through the 70s, 80s and 90s, there was a consistent bridge between average house prices and wages. It was about 2 to 3, the ratio. The last 2 decades, that ratio's blown out, talking home ownership here and mortgages, to 8 to 9. Now, there were some major policy interventions and changes in our tax system in the 90s, late 90s and early 2000s. And so what I'm really sort of alluding to over these 2 periods of time in the history of our housing market is that there is an influence on major policy and intervention by state and federal governments. Fast forward to 2024. The recently established National Housing Supply and Affordability Council released its first State of the Housing System report only a few weeks ago. The report emphasises that Australia is currently facing a housing crisis and predicts that housing affordability will worsen in the near term. It describes a perfect storm in which high interest rates, construction constraints, labour shortages, increased migration and declining social housing investment over the last 4 decades has all left the country with demand excessively outstripping supply, leading to skyrocketing housing costs. I wanted to just pluck 5 of the performance measures that the same report talks about on what a future optimal housing environment might look like. I think that might set the scene a bit tonight. 1, housing is affordable, fit for purpose and secure for households across income and geography. 2, there's a fair access to home ownership or alternative tenures with comparable benefits. 3, there's secure, dignified housing for tenants with a sufficient return for investors. 4, there's a supply of new, well-located housing that matches the needs of the Australian growing population. And 5, experiences of homelessness are reef, rare and non-recurring. So I'm going to finish it there, Pete. Hopefully that sets the scene.
That's given me some great ideas. Thank you. Okay, Natalie, go for it.
Thank you. So I come from the perspective, I guess, or the deep belief that housing is a human right. I guess I'm there with Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, and he put it right there with food and water, and I hold that belief true. I'm aware that it is at an international level recognised as a human right, but in our laws in Australia it's not recognised. We've got a right to vote, we've got a right to a fair trial, we've got a right to religious freedom and to not be discriminated against. We've got a right to acquire property. If we look at our state Human Rights Act, we have a right to privacy. We have a right to participate in public life. We have a right to access health services. We have a right to education, but we don't have a right to a roof over our heads. I come to that as a planner, so I guess bring a different perspective from others on the panel. I come to it with over 25 years of experience preparing, lodging, or assessing and deciding or giving evidence in court about development applications. So I've seen a lot come across my desk or in front of me, and I can see what impact the planning system has on housing. It can be a barrier to certain types of housing or locations of housing, and therefore the price, the size, the tenure, the form of housing. It can also absolutely be a solution. And so I guess the best way I can illustrate it is through my own housing journey. Very briefly, Peter, give me one more minute.
Sorry?
So I left home, couldn't afford my own home, of course, so rented. Once I did gather enough funds to have a deposit to buy my first property, it wasn't a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2-car garage house that is one of the few products that are on the market right now for first home buyers. It was a one-bed bedsit. It had one uncovered car space. It had no visitor car parking. It was in a 3-story walk-up, and that walk-up would not be able to be built today because it wouldn't get planning approval. It's in a location where you would have to be only 2 stories, so that would take off 1/3 of the yield, and you'd have to put twice as many car parks, and that's just, one example. So I wouldn't have been able to afford that product if it had to be bigger, it had to have more car parking spaces, and there were less on the same amount of land. I moved from that place into a townhouse, and many of you might know that we banned the townhouse in Brisbane's low density or low density neighbourhoods about 5 years ago. So that's not a very common housing option anymore for people that were happy to have a small piece of courtyard and a 2-bedroom townhouse. It's just not an option in Brisbane unless it's very old stock, and there's few and far between. Once I moved from my townhouse, I bought my first house. I was very proud of that. It was a house that was on 212 square metres of land. It was a little workers' cottage, probably built in the 1940s. And it fitted fine. It was 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom, fitted on its 212 square metres because the developer had already built 2 townhouses out the back of that property and subdivided those as well. That wouldn't be possible today either because we've increased our minimum lot sizes. So that would have had to be 260 square metres at the front, 350 at the back. You would have fitted 1 townhouse out the back. My property would have had to be bigger, and I would have been priced out of the market. And that's just one example of how planning has taken the stepping stones out of what was my housing journey into home ownership. Those types of housing are just not possible to be built with our current planning rules that we have today. So much so, it bothered me so much that I set up a group called YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard, Queensland. There's various other groups around the world. It certainly was not my idea, but I thought we needed to have a voice for more housing. We need more housing, more types of housing, and all the services that support housing to make for better living. So I guess that's me. Thank you.
That's a great start. Okay, that was really good. I think we've already got a sense of what good is to each of our panellists, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper now. I'm going to start with you, Natalie, given you really went for it. No, sorry, I'm going to start with Claire, actually, and then come back to you, Natalie. I think now, Claire, good to you, as I understand it, in broad terms, is where effectively the government gets out. It's over-regulated. You don't need all that investment. The market will serve us right if it's just allowed to do so.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yeah, my utopia is for housing is a free market. That's 100% right. A market that can grow at sustainable rates where supply can meet demand, where house prices and construction costs all rise at levels that are similar to CPI, where we don't have a government that artificially distorts demand with sugar hits or absorbs the entire construction workforce with a poorly planned infrastructure rollout. I think the federal budget on Tuesday was pretty eye-opening. It's doing absolutely nothing to help the situation. It included $89 million to boost training positions, but only $1.8 million to fast-track assessment of 1,900 migrants with the right skills. The industry is actually asking for 486,000 migrants. These are new people who have the right skills that can help deliver the housing that we need. But we didn't get that. We got 1,900. So it feels like the unions are running the country, and it suits them to keep wages high, to keep migrants low, because it keeps us wages high. So right now we have a huge demand pressure, but a construction industry that just can't manage the workload. And no one wants to believe it, but our housing crisis is about to get a whole lot worse, and unless there is a full reset in our industry.
Now, hang on, Jackson, you can't go along with that, surely. At the very least, I would have said from what you were telling me that you would think there is a need for quite strong government intervention, at least in terms of social and public housing, housing for essential workers. I mean, are you going to stick for this?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely going to jump in there, although I thought Nat was next, but if that's okay with you, Nat.
Do not get comfortable in your seats.
Okay, Pete.
You never know when it's coming.
So
It's like the hand of God.
All right, Peter. Oh, look, I do accept where Claire's coming from. I think to go a little bit further on the government's role, and I mentioned the big build in my opening remarks, there's no big public workforce anymore. I mean, the government just does contracts with the private sector to build that stock. So I think essentially we're talking about the same thing. It's the capacity and productivity of the construction workforce. The same workforce is building the same stuff, building the bridges, building the hospitals, building the homes. And that is absolutely a challenge that we're worried about too, Claire. And as a sector that relies on partnerships with the private industry to build stuff at scale, it's particularly concerning. But I'll be a bit controversial and say that I do applaud the government, the state government and federal government for setting some targets, because, I know those targets are controversial and have every chance of maybe not being reached, but I think aspiration's important. And I think aspiration can drive innovation. And something that I think our sector is desperately needing is more innovation and technology development. I know there's people in the audience that are involved in that part of the system. So if anything, I would love to see more focus going into that while we work through this construction industry crunch. But I can't debate the numbers that Claire mentioned in terms of the workforce challenges, Pete.
So, Natalie, following on from that, so first of all, I've got all the right lingo, love. I loved your authenticity, bringing us lived experience. I'm really picked that. And I am going to be the first person to sign up to YIMBY. I love it. But let's a human right. Hang on. What do you mean by a human right? Because I think even you accepted, as you were talking about your vision of what we needed, that in our society we have a right to hold private property. So I've got the right to buy a house as cheap as I can.
Yes, you do.
To sell it as expensively as I can.
Correct.
And to rent it out, if I want to, at the highest rent that I can.
That's right.
So where does your human right come in? What is the human right there that you want to be? I know. I can see Cameron's bouncing. That's why I've done it last.
So I say that it's a human right for all. I would like to see housing for all in our country. And I think it's an interesting thing for me to see that education is for all. If we look at the supply of schools across Queensland, there's around 10,000 schools. About 2/3 of those are public schools. If we look at housing, what's the percentage? About 3.6% of our housing in Queensland is social and public housing. So we haven't been providing enough. No wonder it's not a human right.
Well, hang on a moment. Hang on.
That.
We've got 420 dwellings in Australia per 1,000 people. 420. Now, it's true, if you go to Italy, they've got 600. But 420 is about what you've got in the United States, the same as Canada, same as New Zealand, give or take. And if you look at Europe, I can think of 10 countries where the number of dwellings per 1,000 people is less than we've got. So I'm trying to get, well, what's the problem? What's the crisis here?
people sleeping rough, people not having a shelter, people not having a home to live in. So that's one. And I think it's interesting because, of course, it affects the most vulnerable in our community the most. And young people trying to get into the housing market. So that's where I think it's hitting most. We've got, a community of young people thinking that they're never going to have the opportunity for home ownership in our country.
I'm going to come back. There's so many things, but Cameron, I can see you. No, Cameron, I bought your book. No, I haven't bought your book. I haven't read your book. I've read the back cover of your book before we started. And depending what happens tonight, I may well go and buy your book. But all the good stuff is on the back cover, okay? And what the back cover tells me is that you think this whole housing debate has been hijacked. So tell me why, but not in 240 pages.
No, I'll just respond to a few of the other ideas that have come up. And I think maybe I'll talk about the need for more construction skills. I don't think changing immigration solves that, right? So all my adult life, we've had skills shortages and skills shortages lists and immigration trying to address them, and nothing's changed, right? Because the competition for workers comes from the economy generally, right? People can shift into other things. So it's always the case when the economy's hot, it's hard to hire someone in every sector. And of course, an extra 100,000 people need an extra 42,000 dwellings, right? And we only build, what do we build a year? 160,000, right? So it's a massive, massive increase in what we need to just accommodate the people who are meant to build houses. So I don't think that works mathematically. On the human right, I agree. That's why I've proposed in the book, we should treat housing a bit more like public schools, and everyone should have the option, if they need, to have this sort of backup social insurance in housing. And I'm pretty agnostic on how to do that. And I think for me, that's one of the, what do we want from housing? I want a backup from the market, however we do that. That would be my thing. And the last thing before I turn it back over, I've been on panels like this in Wellington, Vancouver, Sydney, Melbourne in the last 6 months. And every city has said to me, oh, we're the worst for housing, aren't we? No, it's our politicians, it's our this. And I'm like, this is every city right now. Could it not be that the macroeconomy that we're all experiencing jointly, this is a symptom of that macroeconomic process, the inflation, for example, that we've seen? Because, everyone else has it. So I think it's always good to zoom out and look abroad and look at Europe, and they're having the same problems, and their unions aren't as bad as ours, but they're having the same problems. And the last thing, price to income ratio, I wrote it down. We should never use that, right? Because $1 million house is cheap when interest rates are 2%. It costs you 20 grand a year to rent the money, right? So you've got a $100,000 house, you can rent $1 million and live in it. Right? But at 8% interest rate, costs you 80 grand in interest. $1 million house is very expensive. So the same price to income ratio has a very different sort of meaning. And of course, price to income ratios have gone up since the 80s when they were high. Then we had the 90s recession, and they've been structurally lower. So I think if you are musing like what caused that high price to income ratio, it's interest rates. And it's the same in the UK and the same in the US as well. So they're my points to follow up. Thank you.
Well, let me follow up with it, because I love that international perspective. And, you get the same arguments in the same cities, but there are certain things that we say in Australia and assume in Australia, which may not be assumed in the other countries you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Home ownership is a good example, right? Australia has a very strong commitment that people should be able to buy their own home. Now, in truth, it hasn't changed much. It's still 66% ownership. When I bought my first home in the 70s, I think it was about 68%. Not a big change, but what has happened, which is one of the creations, is that, when I bought a house in the 70s, it took about 5 times the cost was about 5 times my disposable income. Today, it's getting up to 9 times, so there's a problem. But my question is, why don't we just give up on this idea? Why do we still want to promote home ownership. There are plenty of countries that don't. I mean, yes, UK, Canada, New Zealand, I know those do, but, you know, Denmark, 60%, Germany, 48%, Switzerland, 42%. Are we just setting ourselves up that we think we have to retain 2/3 of people trying to be able to buy their own house?
A very good question. I mean, is 100% home ownership what we want from housing? Is that the answer to what we're here for today? Maybe. Look, the way I see home ownership, and this gets back to my opening remarks about what we're seeing is this adjustment process in the market. Homeowners only have to compete once with other buyers. And then if rents rise, inflation happens, incomes change, they don't have to outbid people to stay where they are. But renters do. Every year they have to outcompete someone to stay put. So I actually say, you know, home ownership, it's the ultimate rent control. You set your rent once and your landlord never puts it up again, right? So that's the benefit from home ownership. That's why it's so good for retirement, right? Because we don't have to keep paying and outcompeting other people. So home ownership is one way, in my perfect world, to escape this rental competition, right? So we can promote that, we can subsidise it, do whatever. And another way is to have renting in a regulated sector where you don't have to keep competing with other people. And that sort of solves this homelessness issue of people being pushed out, being outcompeted for their rent. So I think you can do it multiple ways. And some countries have chosen regulate the rental sector severely. Okay, you probably don't want to be a landlord in that country if you've come from being an Australian landlord, right? Because your obligations are very onerous. But we could go that way. I don't think it matches our culture very well. I think pushing home ownership and sort of more social, public, subsidised, non-market housing is the way to go.
So, Jackson, do you think that means we should really think that what we should be focused on as the object is, in fact, providing rental housing, and particularly those who are more disadvantaged in getting access? I mean, it is true. You go back in the 1990s, and I think even then you had 5.6% of dwellings, fixed as 5 to 6% of dwellings, social housing. You're less than 4% today. Is that the big failure? Is that where you would think that we have to make a difference?
So just on your former question though, Peter, is home ownership the answer? I think that's not really the right question. I think what we're on about is choice.
Yep.
Housing choice, housing diversity, options. People can freely participate and have the ability to participate with some equity across the housing spectrum. And so one of the things I want to pick up on, Pete, is the home ownership rate has changed. It's actually declined. It's trending down, particularly with different age cohorts. It is still close to a third. Close to two-thirds, as you say.
It's true.
However,
age cohort,
not outright ownership though. And so the example Cameron gave is an example of outright ownership. I mean, if I'm still paying off my mortgage, I'm struggling in some cases at the moment, depending on when I got into the market. So I think when we talk about home ownership, we talk about that 60% figure, which is trending down. Just to be clear, for the last 3 decades, it's trending down. That means that we've got lifelong renters entering into the marketplace. Yep. It means that people that are making a choice to stretch into the home ownership market when they probably can't afford to because they're struggling to live in this fragile rental market at the moment because they don't want to change rental properties with their kids 5 times in 4 years. So, you know, I just think sticking in the abstract too long here, we miss a lot of nuance in this current debate. Just want to stress that.
So, from your ideal world, governments, for example, would not just be intervening in the rental market. You're saying that they should be intervening in terms of first home buyers?
No, I just think the government clearly has a role to play. I mean, I also sort of tend to agree with what Claire's saying, is that the government should be supporting the industry, who's always done the heavy lifting in addressing housing supply. The question is how? What policy and interventions? One of the things we've seen in the last couple of years in Queensland and in Australia is everyone is putting their shoulder to the wheel. There's never been more policy announcements in housing or planning.
Yeah, that's right.
I think what we haven't had enough time to evaluate is the success of all those measures. And I'd certainly, for one, would like to let some of them have a little bit more time to see if they actually will succeed. But I actually think government does have a role to play, Pete, and I'll tell you where I think it is. It's in helping people on the bottom 2 income quintiles. It's that disadvantaged community. We're privileged enough in Australia to live in this civilised society where I think we do need a safety net. The question is, what is the safety net and how does it apply to the housing market? So if you look at countries like Finland, who have a high proportion of social housing, Singapore, Japan, other countries like that, the safety net is much higher and there's not as much reliance on the rental market. So I do think the government has a role to play, absolutely.
But then maybe, as you're talking about it, the housing crisis is not really a housing crisis at all. It's actually a manifestation of income inequality and people who don't have the resources. I mean, if you think about the pandemic crisis, and I actually did some writing on this, there were lots of bad things, but one of the things that was very positive, I think, was the extent to which Commonwealth government came in quickly with JobSeeker and JobKeeper, not to everyone, but so the argument then was that for those in the most disadvantaged situations, the lowest income, actually the pandemic was pretty good because their income actually rose, and there was evidence that the housing problem then became less of a problem. Now we're going back to, well, how can we increase the supply of housing or push rentals down? So maybe all the housing crisis is, a small but important chunk of a much bigger crisis.
Yeah, well, I mean, sorry, the housing crisis, I think we're getting down to the point. It's not like a general crisis, is it, for everyone? Because when I do my book tour, I do a bit of audience participation. Is anyone interested in a quick show of hands? I would like all the homeowners to put their hands up. Everyone who's a homeowner. And now, just leave them up if you're having the worst housing crisis of your life, and the rest of you put them down. Okay. Now the renters can put their hands up. Not that many. And then leave them up if you're having the worst housing crisis of your life, and everyone else can put them down. Okay, so we've got about 8 people out of 230. Okay, so we're down at 3%. So it doesn't
I think it
really
depends which room you're in, Cameron. I know the rooms I go to around the state, the numbers are a lot higher.
But let's be clear. Of course, you can, 3% of 26 million is a lot of people if you get them all in one room too. But if you go out on the street, it's a small number,
and
right?
We'll also bump into 100,000 people sleeping rough.
But part of what you're talking about isn't just the income disparity. It is, you put your finger on it, it is this intergenerational. So I have to say I look around this room and there are people of a certain late youth in the audience. And people of my age, if you ask us, of course, we're saying, let our house prices rip. Why do we want to keep house prices down? That's actually how we're making our wealth. It is the young ones coming in who get told by the bank to go to the bank of mum and dad to help them. And my, I suppose, concern there is what you're doing, and Australia hasn't done this in the past, but has the potential that what you're doing through the housing market, house ownership market, is actually you are starting to build in social inequality or less social mobility, because it's those of us in the market now with the houses that can then assist our children and grandchildren to buy the houses. I don't know how that's how you'd see it, Jackson. Will you go first, if Natalie? Yeah.
Oh, I'll jump in. Yeah, I think absolutely. You need the bank of mum and dad to get into home ownership if you're a young person.
And this is a good place, by the look of it. If I was young people here, I'd come into this audience.
Yeah, anyone ready to adopt? I think that's why the YIMBY message really resonates with young people.
Yeah.
They've got skin in the game. They're out there and they're really saying, is there room in this city for me?
So, okay, so we let the market grow. But this is one of the problems I got with the market. So I know much more about Sydney than Brisbane. But I can't help finding, as we're increasing the density of housing, and I don't mind increasing the density of housing, I'd like to get rid of a lot of that regulation, it somehow doesn't seem to apply to the suburbs that already have the wealthiest houses. We keep building more in terms of the low-income ends of town. Now, is that just the market working, or do you have any concerns of that in your ideal model?
Look, I think Nat sort of spoke about that. We did have the townhouse ban, which was very much a community-led thing that the Brisbane City Council had to sort of act on, and I think it massively took the industry back. That was back in 2019. So, look, I think it was the wrong decision. We also increased car parking rates at the same time, which again sort of adds to the cost of development. But I think now we're starting to see a bit of a change where we are focusing on the missing middle and having that in the right locations with the right amenity and infrastructure and access to shops and to transport. And I think there is now a willingness at different levels of government to have more affordable housing in areas that previously didn't want it. I think the biggest issue that our industry is facing is more around, it's not that hard to get approvals in Brisbane. I know we were talking about this before, Peter. The local councils and the state government is actually really trying to facilitate development at the moment. There's a lot of, I think, 20,000 DAs that have been, 20,000 dwellings that were approved last year. In terms of houses, I think 12,000, 8,000 for units. The issue that we have is not around approvals, it's around delivery. And without wanting to sound like a broken record, it doesn't matter how many approvals you can get if the project is not viable. And that is the issue that we're facing.
So let me come back to that then, the not viable. So I understand it's not no regulation. At a certain stage, government's regulations can be helpful, but you and I will both sign up to YIMBY in terms of where housing should be able to be built. But the fundamental problems you're talking about, which I'm very sympathetic to, the cost of labour, the cost of procurement, the cost of supplies from overseas, which is clearly reflected in the cost of housing at the moment, combined with difficulties with regulation. What can government or should government do in that instance?
Look, I think, I know I'm coming across as a full-blown capitalist. I'm not. I very much have a socialist side to me. And I think Nat touched on it incredibly well in terms of, you know, our government does provide, you know, education and access to healthcare and roads and transport, and it's a fantastic system. There is a balance between socialism and capitalism. I'm certainly not promoting that we just leave it up to the business owners to decide how our country is run. There's definitely a place for the government to intervene, and I think they are doing that through HIF and HAF and Quick Starts and all the fantastic funding initiatives that are being delivered. I just think the issue that we have now is there is a lot of money being pumped into this sector. We're trying to suck it up through a straw because we're relying on community housing providers to partner with developers to deliver on the 14,000 homes that the government is now promising, or whatever the number is. Sorry, I've probably got that wrong. But it is a huge, investment that they are doing. So they are helping, and but unfortunately, it comes back to capacity and resources and the ability for the construction industry to deliver the houses for the social and affordable housing, the CHPs. And I'm sure, Jackson, you're probably advocating on that as well. It's not my space. But yes, government regulation is important, and I think they are trying. But I also think that over-regulation is not healthy for our industry, and we need to be able to go and hire the builders that we want, hire the trades that we want. We need to be able to negotiate contracts on our own terms. We can't have the government running that aspect of our business, which is what is happening.
Well, your scenario, the government could save quite a lot of money because its essential intervention would be around the regulatory side.
Exactly. If the government could step in around the regulatory side, I think that would have a massive impact on our business and just basically free the reins where there's more competition. I think competition is healthy in the market at the moment. We don't have competition. We are told what contractors and subcontractors we can use, and that is not a free market.
Now, if we were in a Teams meeting right now, I can see that both Cameron and Jackson are putting up their little golden hands. So, Cameron and then Jackson.
So, I guess I just want to maybe, can I get a question in? Is that allowed?
Yeah, you can do anything. Yes.
Maybe Claire and Natalie, I agree on a lot of, there are a lot of bad regulations. I'm an economist, right? I'm going to agree with that. I guess to focus on the bigger question, how much cheaper would rents be, and how many fewer homeless people do we think there would be if there was,
more
less
housing,
union? Yeah,
more
but
housing would deliver
there's more houses than ever,
in
right?
housing in supply would drop rents by 10%.
20% of the total stock. So 2.2 million
to increase
homes.
stock, it would reduce its supply and demand, and you're an economist. It is the most basic elements of our economy. By increasing supply, you've reduced pricing.
But you keep coming
Just
back
remember-
to that
just
stock.
remember-
I'm just interested
Let
in this.
that one play out. I'd like to see where that goes.
Keep going.
Okay.
Go on.
Let's get in a time machine and go back 30 years and have this conversation. You've told me, oh, it's supply. If there's more housing, rents will come down. And I tell you, I'm from 2024. I'm in the Princess Theatre arguing with you that we actually have increased more housing per person than any point in human history, and you're still telling me we haven't solved it. So how would you convince that time traveller?
Were you around in 2016 when we delivered 10,000 apartments into the market in Brisbane? That had a massive impact on prices and rents. So it took years for us to absorb that supply. And I think
and then so we slowed down building after that, did we?
Well, we had to. Basically what happened was there was a huge supply from 2014, 16, and then their market basically had to mop it up from 2017 and 18. So we had an oversupply of apartments in Brisbane. And then what happened in 2019 was there was a $2.3 billion government fund called the Home Builder Grant, which basically pulled forward years and years and years of demand for us to deliver it all in one time. And there were capacity strengths in the market to deliver all of that.
Oh, I agree with that. What I'm saying is, you've just said that you supplied a lot of homes, but then you had to stop. So how do we know?
Because we're land banking. We're land banking.
How do we know that, that if we change this situation, we won't also find ourselves in 2028 in the same situation and slowing down again? You see what I'm saying? Like there's a cycle.
I see what you're saying. I tell you what I'm feeling. I've lost control of the moderation here.
Because it comes down to project viability. Yes, I worked for a big developer. We had a master plan over at Bowen Hills, which had a master plan for 2,500 apartments, but we couldn't deliver those apartments because it was not financially viable. The construction costs and the rates that we could sell them for meant that we wouldn't have made a profit.
Well, here we are. So everybody, I think we all agree it would be a good thing, to try and build more housing, a greater diversity of housing. But I'm going to do one of yours now. Let us imagine you've got 1,000 people in front of you and you've got 420 dwellings. Who here doesn't think they could find a way to distribute 1,000 people around 420 dwellings in a sensible way? So what I'm suggesting is not that we don't need more housing, but surely the problem, and it really is coming to you, Jackson and Natalie, is the way this housing's actually being distributed. You could imagine that number of dwellings for that number of people perfectly well. It's not perfectly well because of the distribution. And I suppose part of it comes back in this. Are investors, therefore, who own 2, 5 or 10 dwellings, part of the problem or part of the solution? I'll go to you first.
Oh, that's a jam-packed question there, that one.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, look, just on the first bit, and I just going back to where you were a little bit earlier, you were like, well, what's the role of governments? And I still make the point, it's in that sub-market housing space where you asked, and so Claire talked a little bit about the market delivering, but they can't deliver sub-market product without government investment. Won't change in the future. Hasn't changed in the past. Government has a role to play with capital or subsidy or land or something there in between. And so in terms of delivering sub-market housing, it's absolutely crucial that there's support from government. Just want to make that point first. Your point about the rental market is it predominantly relies on mum and dad investors, or colloquially known or phrased in Australia. 95% of that market own 1 or 2 properties. 20,000 Australians, I think, have a large portfolio. So I think when we frame this argument, we've got to really look at the ABS stats and kind of understand what that looks like. So the 1 and 2 properties owned by mum and dad investors is really fragile. It's a fragile market for us to rely on, particularly for vulnerable Australians. And it needs to be diversified. It needs more institutional ownership. And one of the quickest ways to deliver that over time is funding the not-for-profit sector, who does the heavy lifting in other countries around the world. And that's the community housing sector. And I see some of them in the audience tonight. They are effectively the first players in the build-to-rent space, where they take an entire property and provide rental product. It sits in that subsidised market in perpetuity, and it continues to reinvest in itself over time and grow if the government supports it. And we've had a real issue with that in Queensland with the government settings to enable that sector to grow. And it can do a big part of the heavy lifting in the future if we get those settings right.
So what you would do, in this ideal world again, there would be much more government support to help build the funding, but then pass over to community social enterprises to run and manage that housing.
Yeah, there's a variety of ways you can do it. I mean, the state government in Queensland, for example, have a public housing portfolio of 73,000 properties, which is quite large, second oldest public housing authority in the country, in fact, behind South Australia, I think. Our sector manages about 12,500 of those properties on short-term leases from the government. They can't leverage that to grow. They can't really debt finance against that to grow. In other states and territories, they've been supported by their state government to have some of those assets transferred to them onto their balance sheet so they can debt finance against that portfolio and build more properties themselves. These are settings that have been around for a long time, for 30 years in Australia and other states and territories. So I do think that's a small part of this. It's not the mainstream part. It's a very small part of it. But the part that continues to get missed in this equation is the bottom two income quintiles. And one of the reasons why I think this conversation is so fierce again now, because Cameron talks about cycles, but in this cycle, the reason why it's so fierce is because this issue is impacting third quintile now and fourth quintile. So people in this audience are struggling with housing now. And I think that's why it's in the paper every day, and it's why it's in the news every day, and it's why it's on the TV. But historically, it has always been difficult for the bottom two income quintiles, and it always requires government support and subsidy.
So my question is, and then Natalie, you're absolutely right, but isn't this a recurring cycle? I mean, I remember there when I was paying housing interest in the double digits. And we were saying the housing market will collapse. In spite of it, it seems to go on. You're right, we depend very heavily on rented accommodation, on small... My question is, do you want to do that? Do you want to keep giving tax concessions for investing in property for other people to rent?
I think, going back to my earlier comment about housing diversity and housing choice, I don't want to make that decision for anyone. Through my 20s and 30s, a little bit similar to Nat's story, I rented all around the country because it was convenient. I had the ability to choose to do that. I could pay more than 30% of my income in rent if I wanted to live in a more desirable location. I actually had the luxury to make that choice. I think that luxury is becoming harder and harder for more Australians at the moment, maybe for various, economic factors. But there's some groups that don't have that choice, that just have to take whatever's available. And at the moment, there's not much available at all. You've only got to go down the road to Musgrave Park to see how many people are sleeping rough there tonight.
Yeah. And you're right. And that group of sleeping rough has now gone to people who are not on welfare but on low incomes, gone to essential workers. So I can see how it's gone. But I just want to come back, Natalie, on that last point, the people sleeping rough. Because I've been involved in organisations that have, I think, been quite successful in finding housing for those people. But I have to say, when I'm dealing with it, I'm not sure I'm dealing again with a housing crisis, because the only way I have found to make it successful is if you wrap around many of those people with help on some substance abuse problems, help in mental health. There are a whole series of reasons, not just income, which mean for that really bottom of the market, it's beyond, I suppose, a housing crisis. It's something else.
I absolutely agree. It's something else, but I think that there are so many factors contributing to it. So, for one experience I had, someone who was wanting to set up and provide shelter, emergency shelter. So effectively, people are sleeping rough outside, where he wanted to invite them in and let them sleep, in an empty car park underneath an office building overnight. Let them go back over day, but let them have a good night's sleep to help them get on with a better life. A lot of support, a lot of community development officers in the council said, great, but you better go and talk to a town planner. And that's when he had a problem. It's difficult. So this challenge that people have to build housing...
So it was the town planner that did it?
Well, I think this is something that people don't quite understand, that planning doesn't discriminate, perhaps. So if you're doing a development, it could be an emergency shelter, it could be a luxury, homes at $4 million. It still goes through our planning system and it can be very challenging. So we're trying to find ways to unlock that so that you can supply the housing that we need much more quickly.
That's great. Now, you can see I've already sort of lost control of the moderation of this panel, but now I'm really going to let it go because I reckon there's a whole lot of people out there with questions. You can either ask the question generally or you can target it like I do at one or the other. I may do it. So is there a question, first of all, where I can see people on the ground floor? Yep.
So as you've been speaking, I've received over 40 questions.
All right.
I won't read them all. But one of the themes was in innovation and trying to break down some of these rules. People mentioned renting out rooms in houses which are incompletely occupied. People mentioned using high-rise buildings which are incompletely occupied. And also changing, is there any appetite for changing the local government rules about townhouses and small block developments, etc.?
Yeah, it's a very good question because it's almost what can we do in the short term about this?
I'll jump in. So granny flats, being able to rent out your granny flat was something that we've been advocating for about 10 years. Then we had a housing roundtable and all of a sudden overnight you can rent out your granny flats. But it is one of those examples where people don't realise that, people didn't realise up until then that you couldn't rent out your granny flat. And people were literally until they got an enforcement notice, a show cause notice, an enforcement notice, and then they would end up in the courts and then they would come to a town planner and say, help me out of this situation. And so that is the reality that a lot of people were living, that they wanted to provide that housing. They wanted people to be able to sleep in their house, provide a space, and they were not able to. And it wasn't just that people were doing it and turning a blind eye. They were not. People were getting enforcement notices and getting shut down and then getting the cost orders to fight those things. So we can change planning laws overnight if we know that they're in the way. That's just one example.
Yeah, I think it's a great question as well because it goes a bit to what Jackson you were saying, and intergenerational as well. The reason I think most of us think you could put 1,000 people in 420 dwellings is if we worked under Stalin and you could just tell people where to go. One of the problems you've got, of course, and it's because of the way we deal with old age in this country, is you have significant number of people, empty nesters with 4 or 5 bedroom homes, themselves living in it, but where there is a significant disincentive financially to downsize and sell, because if they do and put money in the bank, it's treated differently than if it sits in their house. But there's huge potential, I think, as I would see it, to address the problem.
Can I just jump in? That is a good idea. We should do all of this, but New Zealand has a universal pension and you can sublet or sell your house and there's no stamp duty either, and they have the same, wealthy people overusing space issue that we have. And I think it boils down to that we allocate housing by price, not by need. And, we're back to sort of square one, right? Like those homeless people got outbid by someone else to rent their place, and maybe we should have regulated their rents so that they didn't have to get outbid. I don't know. That topic hasn't come up
yet. Well, but the market theory, at least, is it doesn't matter if you're building really expensive houses for people to buy, because you'll effectively have a filtered down effect. Is that what you would see or not?
I think that's what Natalie was saying, and that's true. I mean, it's all supply, right? Yeah. People reorganise into the stock we have, and they do it by price using their income.
I'm just interested, Claire, if you believe in the filter down.
Do I believe in the...
That if people you build enough expensive houses, it's okay because people will build them, and that'll free up houses then down below.
Look, I think there's an element of that, and people do promote it, that if, you encourage older people out of their big homes and into apartments, and that frees up rental properties and that sort of thing, there's definitely an element. I don't know that there's much substance behind it. I think it's more of a theory.
Yeah, can I add to that?
Yeah,
Look, I definitely, it's an economic theory, that's for sure. I think in practice, for some groups, that's harder to kind of realise. And again, I keep coming back to the bottom two income quintiles, but think of people that need to be located in close proximity to public transport systems, for example, health services and other support services. The trickle-down theory of available stock sort of stops at that point to some degree. So again, it's back to that nuance of, but absolutely it's distribution. I think I've seen some great data recently, and Cameron might even know the numbers, about our average number of people per property is declining. Absolutely. There's less people living in the available stock. It's absolutely true. So I think it is about, the sorts of measures and approaches we take to get more value out of the properties that we have. Absolutely. Without forcing those decisions on anyone, of course, given the society that we live in.
And I'll just add, though, that yes, I think that there's a need for more housing across the whole housing continuum, but what we're providing a lot of is 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2-garage, single-family dwellings on lots in Ipswich, Caboolture, Beaudesert. We're finding it very hard to build what I found were my stepping stones into housing, and what I think, people who are getting into their first jobs or, finding their way into our housing market, that supply of new 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom, no car park housing is just so difficult to supply in our existing urban footprint, even though it's land that's, already urban, it's already serviced, free of constraints, but it's just so hard to get more housing of the type that might meet the needs of different people in society that don't need their 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2-car. They're not ready for that. They don't want to be mowing the lawn every weekend.
Next question. Have you got another one you want to give us, or is it in the audience? Yep, over here. It's always the furthest distance from the microphone. There
was a couple others in that list too that we can come back to if we've got time.
G'day, thank you panel, enjoying it very much. We've grown up in a microeconomic system that's advantaged investors and speculators over homeowners. I'm wondering, can you envisage a system, instead of levelling the playing field, where you actually advantage the Australian who wants to buy a home for their family over speculators or investors?
Who's got it there?
Yeah. Happy to jump in on that one. I totally understand where you're coming from, and I think there's plenty of research out there that investors are basically, getting rid of first-time buyers that could have potentially been buying that property. And I think Cameron talks about it in his book, which I did read. Thank you. I've got a spare copy.
Yeah,
but I think we also need to recognise that those investors also do provide much needed rental product into the market as well. And without the mum and dad investors who do own those investment properties, it would basically, wouldn't allow people to rent. And there's just a lot of people that aren't in the position where they can buy right now. They're not at that stage in their life. They don't have the deposit. They can't afford the $1 million for the median house price, or whatever, or $750, what we're up to now. So I think it is really still important to just not discount that part of the market. As much as it might feel like it's taking away from private ownership for other people, it does provide a much needed, and it's about that housing continuum again. I think it is really, really important to not discount that part of the market.
Yeah, can I just sort of add a response there? So Second World War in Australia, home ownership in the cities was about 43-45%. It got to 71% in the early 1970s, and we did that by subsidising people into home ownership through public housing, rent-to-buy schemes, subsidised land, all those Commonwealth state housing agreements. They actually got, 16% of households out of rental and into home ownership. So yes, it does work, and Singapore's my favourite example, going from 20% home ownership at independence to 88% at the end of the 1980s, so in 25 years, through subsidising into home ownership. So there are ways to do that, and I have proposed in my book that we should be considering that as an option, because it's been done before, and because I think, as I said earlier, home ownership is one way to escape that competition of the rental market, right? Once you're in, you don't have to keep outbidding if your income goes down but everyone else's goes up, it doesn't matter. You don't have to outbid them for the rent. So I think it fits with Australian culture, fits with Australian history. There's many ways to implement it, but that would offer this sort of parallel alternative to ownership in the private market.
I just got one too, Pete, and just to follow Cameron's comment, the one little bit he said there towards the end that I definitely agree is there's a few ways to do it. And I think one of the concerns that many economists have had about some of the stimulus that helps first home buyers is that it has a perverse effect of increasing the cost of home prices overall. And I think it is a popular measure. Like if you asked me, my 23-year-old self, would you like 20k or 30k to get into the market to get you over the line with a deposit and get your first home, I think I probably would have said yes. I think, to use your example earlier, Cameron, of sort of going back to 30,000 feet, that policy area is fraught with danger when it's done en masse. And I think many economists have proved that. What we support as a sector is more targeted measures. There's guarantees that the government can do around the home purchase that can be targeted to income groups and different cohorts. There's shared equity programs that exist, and that's actually common to other countries, as you know, Cameron, which I know you've talked about in some of your work. There are other ways to do it and support it, and I think it's a great ambition of ours that needs to be part of that choice on the spectrum. But I think picking measures that don't artificially inflate prices is worthy of consideration, though.
Can I just clarify to finish that question? Great answer. Sorry, we can applaud for Jackson in a second. To avoid that perverse effect of subsidising 20 grand and everyone can now pay 20 grand, you can actually operate on the development side or the selling side as well as the public sector. So you can sell at a regulated price to these people, which is the sort of Singapore way and some of the traditional way with public land subdivisions.
Great. Now, there's people up in the top balcony, I think. Is there a question up there? There is a microphone up there, I think. Someone waving. No questions up there? Yep, no, there is. I feel like I'm in a musical theatre where you should wave your hankies in the back row.
My question is about the form of this sort of housing rejuvenation that we need. The City Council at the moment is proposing basically to let it rip in the inner city within 5 kilometres so that you can go to unlimited height, say 90 stories if you've got the money and the capacity and the builders. Is that really the solution or is it really to kind of distribute the density around the city up to 10 stories with great streets and affordable housing mixed in where the centres already exist? And rather than protecting those low-density suburban areas, distribute the housing so that it can distribute the load around the city.
I'll jump into that. Great question, thank you. I think that's probably a very broad question. I think that we need a whole lot of different solutions, and I certainly welcome some opportunity to get some more infill housing and height and a reduction in car parking requirements, particularly in the inner city. So that's the Brisbane inner city strategy. There's also a lot of work being done in suburban renewal precincts as well as, yes, protecting the single-family dwelling areas still seems to sit there, and that's at odds for me. I think we need to look at ways to deal with housing form rather than housing tenure. So yes, when you're further away from transport or employment or shops, sure, the form of building and housing can be smaller, but that doesn't need to be a single-family dwelling. You can fit 2 dwellings in the same size building as a house. You can even fit 3. And so I think we need to step away from being so specific about land use definitions and get much more based on form. And that form of housing or size needs to be allowed to get bigger when we are trying to basically get better use out of our public transport system. You know, let's let more people live around public transport. That's when it works better, and we can actually get more transport happening. I think that therefore there's a range of measures. We need some more height right in the middle of the city. So I think Kurilpa's probably the one that you mentioned there with the unlimited heights. The way I look at Kurilpa, I'm not sure if anything's getting built at unlimited heights in this construction market. So maybe that's a worry that we don't all actually have to have in reality, but it's being treated as part of the CBD. So if the CBD is unlimited with maximum car parking rates, then where do you draw a line around just CBD? Does it have to have a line where the river is? Probably not. So perhaps it needs to be thought about in that context. Then yes, of course, you're going to step down in heights the further that you get from those areas. I do think parking reform is absolutely critical in our city. It was only 4 years ago when we banned townhouses that we also went in the absolute opposite direction, that pretty much every other big city that Cameron was talking about took away parking minimums. We were increasing ours. So we were making developers put 2.5, so essentially 2 for every 2-bedroom, 3 for every 3 or 4-bedroom. That's just the number of car parking space per dwelling plus the visitor bays. And then when we look at a cost, if you're building a basement, what is it, 80,000, 100,000? If you don't need that car parking space, you still had to buy it effectively. And so that's one of those things that absolutely we do need to reform. So pretty broad answer, but we need a lot of solutions.
Pretty good answer. Okay, you got another question amongst the 40?
Peter, I've got a few more coming in online over to your left. So there's been a number of questions about population pressure and to what extent that's driving prices and demand. And the question was asked, when you look internationally, is it the countries with big immigration that are having this problem predominantly?
Yeah, it's related, but it's not only those countries. So Canada is kind of the sister country to Australia, having this unexpected spike in immigration and high rents. So it's definitely an immediate factor that is at play. I mean, everyone who arrives can't just rent wherever. They can only rent in the 60 or 80,000 dwellings in the country that are available that month. Right? So they have to squeeze through this narrow door, and that does create a lot of pressure. But over time, people get distributed between the 11 million existing dwellings. And so that's what we saw from 2006 to 2009. We had a big spike in migration, big rental boom, and then we had the 2010s construction boom, and rents were falling for nearly a decade in Brisbane. So yes, it adds to what I would say is the main factor, which is the global income boom and inflation we've seen, which is, you know, everyone competing for rents. That's like an added factor, but I think it'll be relatively temporary in Australia. So yeah, it's not great this year, and it probably won't be great next year. But I think in 10 years, when we're looking back, we'll be like, oh yeah, we worked through that pretty effectively.
And even as the moderator, I think I'll say something on this. I mean, I can't go back to the 1860s, but I will go back to 1946. And if you think since then, we've been a country that has depended on large-scale migration for 3 generations, increasingly diverse, very successful. And the problem we have now is the problem that emerges from time to time. It's often associated with ethnic ghettos and so on. That large-scale immigration places greater pressure on infrastructure, including housing. The other side of that is the solution to the infrastructure often comes about as the result of the skills and the entrepreneurial zeal that migrants bring. So in a sense, to now say, well, migration has got too high, I think it has, but that's the problem, is essentially saying that we haven't planned or developed enough for that population growth.
Yeah, I think we just have to be realistic that it's hard to build 100,000 homes, right? It takes us a whole year to build 200,000 across the whole country. So we just have to be realistic about the fact that everyone should have access to a home and sort of be reasonable about those rates.
But what has changed, sorry, and I don't want to take the debate off, and it changed without any real public policy. And it came as a surprise during COVID. When I came in the 70s, for at least a quarter century afterwards, we always prided ourselves on Australia essentially was unlike Germany, for example, a country of permanent migration. Most people came here with the knowledge that they would be permanent. Of course, what we've now got is most of those who are coming, most of the population pressures are actually coming from temporary workers. And I think that adds an important nuance in terms of the issue of housing.
And yeah, well said, Pete. Actually, I totally agree with that. And the other point I just wanted to make is when we talk about population policy as a broad term, I think it's important to kind of appreciate that immigration is part of that. I mean, obviously there's natural population growth in each state or territory. And the other thing that Queensland sees more than any other state and territory is internal migration to a much larger degree. And I know in the first year of COVID, where everyone was fleeing Melbourne in particular, but also southern states, we had 50,000 people move here. And that number still remained relatively strong. So all of that's feeding into our inflows. And I just wrote some numbers down here, which the housing people in the room will be familiar with. But I mean, and this is probably just put a little asterisk against it in case immigration targets change. But by 2046, we're expected to see South East Queensland grow by 2.2 million more people. So 2.2 million more people into South East Queensland by 2046. That need 900,000 dwellings, more or less. It's 40,000 per year. So I think whatever our view on population policy, that growth is coming every year, every day, every week. Things like density and all of this, we have to grapple with it. And I know when I go out into the community outside of people that are involved in housing, they don't know about this growth. I spoke to some people in a community forum on the Gold Coast that thought that we only had growth coming because of COVID. And that we were just back to normal numbers again. Like they're not aware of this growth. Yeah. So I think this is another thing to the housing debate is the community actually understanding how much growth is coming to Queensland in particular, and we have some choices on how we actually handle it.
I think I'm quite sort of, I agree. Sorry, yes. I totally agree. I think the issue, you've raised it, you've hit the nail right on the head, 40,000 homes per annum, and look, I'm quite Brisbane-centric focused. At the moment, we're forecasting sort of 2,500 apartments per annum for the next 3 years. Yep. In our peak, back in 2016, when we were delivering sort of, 7,000 to 10,000 apartments per annum, and then we decided to land bank, we did not have the construction crunch that we're having right now. There was probably 10% of the infrastructure spend back in those times. But basically, we need to get back up to 10,000 dwellings or apartments in Brisbane per annum, and we're at about a quarter of that right now. And it's a real issue, and I think you're right. I don't think the community realised just how far short we're going to be on our dwelling targets. And there should be some sort of data and auditing in place where we are measuring this on a quarterly basis.
Okay, next. Yep, there's one on the floor.
Hi. So I think we've sort of danced around this topic a bit of, is it a housing crisis? I mean, Cameron, you gave those questions. I'm one of those 8 struggling renters. Haha, yay. But I think I would argue that if it is a crisis just for those, if it is a crisis just for those lower 2 percentile or whatever, then it's a crisis for all of us, especially for those in the room that are developers or economists or planners. So I guess my question is, what would you like to see? I mean, Jackson, your answers, I can have a guess as someone who works in social housing, but what would your guys' sort of answers be for those 2%? Not just for everyone, and whether we're talking about mum and dad investors or migration or whatever. For those bottom 2% who are the ones that are really struggling, what can we do in the short term to help them?
Okay, Jackson, is that what you would have said?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to go first. Very well expressed, by the way. I missed your name, sorry. Lauren, thank you. I think we're in a time where there is some short-term relief required, and I think the state and federal government's trying its best to respond to that. I mean, we're all going to argue the toss on the best measures, if that's done through the Bowser or whether it's done through energy relief or whether it's done through rent relief, and there are some rent relief programs that are targeted to income types in Queensland. In fact, there's been a significant investment, to be really objective about that, in our state versus others. But they are short-term measures. I guess the larger problem, of course, is, how does this play out? And I think this has taken us back to the conversation of today. Over the next 20 or 30 years, is that 2% always going to struggle in that sort of equation? So what's available now can help today, can help tomorrow, but it's artificial in a sense too, and there's some structural change required. And that does come down to, how we actually best deliver I guess the full suite of housing choices and options we need right across the economy. And at the moment, our concern is that we just don't think we have the workforce to actually deliver that in the short term. The other point I'd make just really quickly is that there's some great research around appropriately housing people on low to moderate incomes, particularly housing people who are sleeping rough. We know that if they're appropriately housed, there are cheaper, and I don't even want to use the word burden, there's better savings to government across health and justice interventions, across other departments and services. There's great research on this, that it's actually cheaper for governments to appropriately house people in those categories. I'm talking right through that spectrum. And also, once we help those people get back into the economy, they make a contribution long term as well. So there's an economic argument to this as much as there is a social one.
I'll just jump in as well. I again say that we also need to look at our housing policy or our planning policy around delivery of housing, because it is very much weighted at the moment to building the big housing product, and it's very hard to build smaller product which is more affordable perhaps by design, or it's those stepping stones into housing. And so yes, there have been some steps forward in that. There's some faster pathways for social and affordable housing through a ministerial infrastructure designation, which is sort of saying social and affordable housing is a type of community infrastructure, which is great. That's when it's on a larger scale. What we're saying is we've got to unlock the smaller scale, the gentle density. And so one little piece of work that some of us here have been really promoting is to say there's a lot of land owned by religious organisations or not-for-profit organisations out there that's already urban land. It's already serviced. It's not constrained, but at the moment, it's almost impossible to build any housing on it. In fact, even if the priest moved out of the presbytery and they wanted to let a vulnerable family move into that, that's probably actually a planning offence unless you get an impact accessible planning approval. So we need to get some exemptions at that level.
Okay, stay there. Otherwise you can find out. So I can see the clock is beating me, so I'm going to ask each of our panellists now for a final thought on this reflection. I think it's been really good. It's certainly an evening where I've actually learned. I think I've changed my mind on a couple of issues, which is great. A final statement, and then I'll do my best to do the impossible, which is to summarise.
All right. I guess my final statement would be to say what I would love is to live in a society where we get excited when there's a new development happening in our street, when we celebrate housing, and when you Google housing protest, look at images and actually see people protesting that we need more housing.
Yeah. And as someone who's in my real job has to try and find places to build aged care accommodation, I would like the same.
Well, this is going to sound far more boring compared to that. It's well expressed, Natalie. But look, we're all about a healthy housing system, and I think it's a system that's on life support at the moment, despite some other contributions tonight. I don't just think it's another cycle. And so for me, it's not just a social housing problem. It's not just a builder's problem. It's not just a finance problem. It's actually a systems-wide issue. It's a system. It operates as a system. And if you make little tweaks here and there, there's usually some sort of return effect somewhere else in the system. So we need a systems-focused approach. It's the only way for me that we get out of this hole. And I think, I know that's really pragmatic and not super visionary, but that's where I'd like to leave my remarks. Thanks.
That's great, Jeff. Claire?
I just think the only way that housing policy can improve is we need to be tapering demand and improving the construction barriers to supply. It's a really simple equation. We need to increase housing supply at a rapid rate, but we need the support of the industry and the government in order to do that. We need to start protecting builders and developers from the predations of the very prominent and active building industry unions and the questionable policy that is transfers position of state government, so that there's more likelihood of builders and developers being financially sustainable. Again, it's supply and demand. More builders and trades will lower the cost of delivery, increasing supply and moderating our housing market. All we want to see is house prices that rise in a predictable and a moderate way. The same with rents, the same with construction costs. We need supply to be in equilibrium with demand.
I guess I differ on what we want. I mean, do we want prices and rents to keep rising? And maybe we want them to go down. This is, I think, the heart of the dilemma. And we talk about supply, but I think that's the means to the end. Is the end what we want the price of everyone's house to go down? Is that what supply does? I don't think we've kind of hit that. And at the end of the day, there are more homes per capita. They're bigger and they're better than any point in history in Australia today. Mm-hmm. So if supply was a problem, then we have solved supply better than any other period in history, and yet here we are. So as we said many times, if there are 420 dwellings and 1,000 of us, we should be able to find a way to squeeze in there. So we're back to that, well, what's the problem with housing? It's this adjustment process of when incomes rise and the economy changes, it's very disruptive. I mean, Henry George wrote Progress and Poverty in the 1870s because he said, isn't it funny, you have an economic boom and all these people go homeless. Yeah. And yet here we are, 150 years later nearly, arguing about the same thing. And so when I look around the world, I find a place that has no homelessness. I was at an event talking about housing and I said, we can solve this because Singapore's a real country and their homelessness rate is 0. And a lady in the audience came up to me afterwards and she said, it's funny you mentioned Singapore. I'm from Singapore. I'm a social worker. I had to travel to Australia to work with homeless people because we don't have any. We just give anyone a house. In fact, we make you live in the house we give you, or the apartment. And as I said, they subsidise people into housing. They have a heavy public sector involvement in construction. It's much more extreme than anything I would propose here, but that is the distributive effect you need, I think, to absorb these people who aren't being met by the private market. And remember, 2/3 of people are being met. Half of the renters, so another 1/6, it's only this small sliver of people. And if we could build up some kind of non-market housing to accommodate those so everyone has the option to get out of the market if it's not working for them, I think we maybe would travel somewhere else to deal with homeless people and have a bit of a better record. Thanks.
Well done. So I'm very glad the Singapore social worker comes here. But I would point out that it can only exist because large numbers of Indian temporary workers are housed in dormitories.
Well, that's not... I mean, Australia got home ownership rates up after the war, right?
Yeah, I know. I'm just saying there's another side to it. So here we are. Here's what I would love. Did you say what I would love? So what I would love is when one's home is not simply imagined to be a commodity to be speculated in a market economy, but actually regarded as the place to live, to give security, to raise families, to have memories. I don't know, am I the only one who regards it as a bit odd that when we buy any other necessities of life, when we buy a car from the showroom, we know as we drive out how it loses value. When we buy furniture, when we buy clothes, a laptop, an iPad, anything else we buy, we assume that whatever we do to it, it will decline in value. But when we buy a house, we don't even assume that what we'd like is a place to live, and I hope it keeps its value over the 20 years I have it. We believe that is, in fact, become our major way of creating wealth. And in a sense, I suspect that's part of the problem that we're having to deal with here. Now, I've had this great panel. They've got really different views. And the idea that I can then summarise it and say, well, after all our debate with you, we're all on the same page. Well, I think we're in the same book. Maybe not Cameron's, but in a book. Let me try and say, well, I think there is an agreement between us, although we would express it differently, that the housing situation, the housing crisis, is part of a much larger challenge that we face in Australia, of which right now it's housing that seems to be the focus. And that it does go back to probably the increasing inequality in Australian society in income and wealth. Nothing like the United States, thank goodness, but nevertheless a trend, and we start to see it being played out. So the idea that we're just dealing with providing a home, when we're dealing with that bottom group of people who are homeless, it is much more than a home. It's a whole level of income and social support that's required. I think there is an absolute agreement between us that it really, Australia has got it right in the sense that housing is largely market-driven. We can argue about whether the government has withdrawn too much from social housing, should get back to spending, being 5 or 6%. But on the whole, that, the market has worked and has worked over a long time. I think we do believe there is a problem. Two, I think. One is the supply of housing that's available and the challenges to building what we think we need. And the second is this issue of the distribution of the dwellings that we've got. And if there is, I think we've suggested, a crisis, it's intensifying in this way, and why it may be different from other housing crises, is it does seem to be widening in its ambit. It isn't just the bottom 5 or 10% anymore. We know in many areas we've got problems with essential worker housing, people on pretty good incomes. We know there's a problem now between generations. We know that there is a demarcation between people who are purchased a house, people have got a mortgage and are purchasing it, and people are renters. It does seem, as we've spoken, that the tensions between those groups seems to be increasing. And that's why I think at the end we're saying, well, the aim should then be to go back to a sustainable, viable system in which everybody can get access to housing, whether it's purchased or whether it's rented. There is disagreement, I think, between us on to what extent government should now intervene to that end and the way it should intervene. And maybe it's because I've tried to keep the conversation above that. When we've got questions, we've got into, well, we could do this or that. But I've tried to keep the discussion about, well, what is it that we want to achieve? Because when we know that, then we can start to think, well, should government invest and where? Should government regulate or deregulate and where? It's once we've got that decision of what we want to continue. So I hope very much that you found it useful. I found it useful. I found it very difficult to control this wonderful panel. They have been a great panel. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm going to hand back the microphone.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the panel. Now, Peter, I know you say you lost control, but I think it was a lesson in excellent moderation, which we always say is the essential ingredient of the Brisbane Dialogue. And I think what we saw tonight was two great features, a terrifically curated panel, different expertise, different views, respectful conversation, and a real adherence to the Brisbane Rule. We saw a spirited, insightful discussion, and for that I thank Cameron, Claire, Jackson, Natalie, and again Peter. It's amazing to have Peter here, that he could find time to be part of tonight. He had travelled up from Sydney to be part of it today in his busy schedule, and as you can appreciate, there's a lot of preparation. And then just to be able to wrap up all those concepts and thoughts, as you did so beautifully, we really appreciate it. So please join me in thanking the panellists and Peter. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Cameron. I want to thank you all for your role in tonight, being here, being so engaged, putting those questions, listening to the different views. And I really encourage us all to encourage this conversation in our workplaces, in our homes, and across all our networks. Good night. Have a good rest of the evening. Thank you.